Welcome to Serious Business on NDTV. 30 minutes of hard business news. One topic, one speaker, and a conversation that's relevant to you. I'm Manvi Sinha Dhillon. The size of India's economy and the pace of its economic growth means that India has enormous energy demand. India is already the third largest energy consuming nation in the world, but what's interesting to note that it's already the fourth largest in terms of renewable energy installed capacity. And we're talking about the world here. Well, India has set itself ambitious targets, installing 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity, producing 5 million tons of green hydrogen annually, cutting emissions by 45% by 2030. These sound like big targets, but there are also big opportunities. And I think there's a 2021 World Economic Forum report that crystallizes some of the opportunity that we're talking about. World Economic Forum in 2021 projected 50 million net new green economy jobs in India and a $1 trillion opportunity by 2030, $15 trillion by 2070. Now, these are all big numbers, and at some level, we can't absorb them. These are ambitious targets. But how is India going to get there? Where is India today? To get the macro and the on-ground picture, we're very pleased to welcome Sumant Sinha, founder, CEO, and chairman of ReNew, a leading decarbonization solutions provider with a pioneering and impressive track record. And he's going to tell us more about ReNew, but I'm just going to take a moment and introduce ReNew to you. It was the first renewable energy company to be listed on the NASDAQ. It produced 17,385 gigawatt hours of renewable energy in FY23, so that's the year that's just gone by, and that would have powered 5 million households annually. It represents 1.9% of India's total installed power capacity. But like the space, its portfolio of activities is evolving. The term decarbonization solutions provider is a relatively new one. What does that mean? What does it cover? What does it encompass? Those are all questions we're going to address in our conversation. Very long introduction, Sumant, but I wanted to set the context. Thank you for joining us on NDTV.
Not at all. Thank you for having me on your show.
Well, I hope I got all the numbers right, and I hope I got the description of ReNew right, but I want to talk to you about, quote unquote, this massive energy transition that India is going through. So we all read about it, we hear about it. You have a vantage point. What is this transition? Where are we now in it?
Yeah, those are big questions. So let me try to take a stab at answering them. See, what is actually happening in the world is that there is a big shift that is happening from fossil fuels to clean energy. And when I say clean energy, that really means solar and it means wind for the most part. It could also mean hydro, although of course hydro has been around for a much longer time. And it could also mean nuclear. But again, nuclear is a little bit slower off the blocks. Now this transition is happening at a very rapid pace. It's partly driven because of all the climate change issues around us, which have got their own imperative and their own urgency, and that we need to deal with really, really rapidly. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later. And it's also being driven by commercial issues. The fact is that today, generating renewable energy is much cheaper than using fossil fuel-based power. And therefore, there is this strong commercial dynamic also driving this change. And so therefore, we are really at the beginning stages of this huge energy transition, which essentially means that over time, all fossil fuels will be replaced by clean energy sources of generation. And that's going to be really fantastic from a climate change standpoint. Now, when I say early stages, I mean really we're looking at really the electricity sector right now. And electricity accounts for only 25% of all energy. Right. And all carbon emissions from energy account for, and I'm going to again get into some numbers, 75% of all global carbon emissions, right? So electricity is only therefore about 20% of total carbon emissions. But now what is happening is to further sort of give legs to the energy transition and make it truly energy versus electricity, we now have the development of things like green hydrogen and so on. which allows us to get further into the energy value chain and really make this a truly proper energy transition. And that's really where we're at right now.
But India specifically, and I said those numbers and I was slightly incredulous as I said them, and I know we've been saying them now for a while, but there is this question that pops up: are we on track to meet the 2030 targets? Not being cynical here, simple question: are we on track?
So you know what? There are multiple targets that we have enunciated as a country. Number one, we have a 2070 net zero target. We have a 2047 energy independence target. And then, of course, if you dovetail it closer to the present time, there's a 2030 target for 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity. All of those are very important, right? And they're important because we have to bend the trajectory of our carbon emissions, and we have to make sure that we generate enough electricity to power India's economic growth, and to do it in the most economical way. Now 500 gigawatts, which is 500,000 megawatts of capacity, and to give you again a context, today the entire installed capacity of the entire power sector of India is 450,000 megawatts. So from the dawn of history of India, till now we've added 450,000 megawatts, and we have to add only from renewables an additional close to 350,000 megawatts by 2030 to meet this target.
Right.
So it is an enormous target, right? But I must say that there is a lot of work going on, and I am pretty hopeful. I won't say confident, because confidence is a strong word, but I'm very hopeful that we would be able to come very close to achieving that target.
So I want to make this real and talk about ReNew, because you've seen this sector since 2011, and I may have used the phrase evolution to describe what you're sort of currently going through in terms of a company. But very quickly, if you can say where you started, where you are today, and where you want to go, it'll give viewers a sense of how this space is evolving.
Sure. Well, look, when we started in 2011, at that time renewables was a very niche sector. It was this little quasi-interesting part of the power sector as a whole, where the big daddy was really coal-based power in India, right? And at that time, renewables was more expensive than coal as well. So that's when we started. The government at that time itself was also encouraging actively more renewable capacity, because there was this view that was developing at the time that for climate change, renewable energy was an important tool to deal with it. So that's when we started. We were adding about a gigawatt and a half of mostly wind at that time of capacity in the country. Most of the capacity addition was coming from coal-based power. What's happened since then is that in 2015, when this government came in, Prime Minister Modi set a target of getting to 175,000 megawatts of renewable energy capacity by 2022. And that was the first time that such a large target was set. And even at that time, 175 was almost half of what was then India's total installed capacity. So very ambitious, right? And you must give credit to the Prime Minister for really having sort of seen a little bit the view about the future and the fact that renewables would have a central role to play. And I think at that time also there was a recognition that ultimately renewables was within your borders. Therefore, it fostered and encouraged energy security. The fact that it would get so cheap, we certainly did not know. Maybe the Prime Minister had a premonition of it, perhaps, who knows. But essentially the target was set. Then in 2017, renewables actually became cheaper. And suddenly the achievement of this target became a lot more straightforward, because now it made sense for us to just add only renewable energy capacity rather than coal-based capacity, right? And then around 2019 is when the Prime Minister first came out of the target of 450,000 megawatts, which was then later changed to 500,000 megawatts by 2030. And by that time, because it had become cheaper, the whole commercial element had sort of rallied behind the achievement of this target, right? Now there are of course various other factors at play as to whether we can meet the target or not, and I'm sure we'll address some of those issues. But purely from a requirement standpoint, India's power demand is growing at 6 to 8% a year. If you look at just the growth, the incremental growth, 50 gigawatts is not going to be able to satisfy even the incremental demand growth, let alone replacing the existing stock of installed coal-based capacities. So by 2030, I suspect that we'll only be reaching that target, right? Now coming back to your question about ReNew. So we've actually sort of gone through this whole wave of renewables becoming more and more central, which is something that perhaps we might not have been able to anticipate at the time we started, but obviously it's played into our advantage because we've always been a purely clean energy focused company, and all the capabilities that we built in terms of project execution, all the understanding of how the sector works, how the wind blows, the sun shines, and the generation, all of that obviously was expertise that we developed over the years. And we now have a fully integrated execution model where we do everything in-house, from project development all the way to the installation of the assets and then to managing the assets as well. That has put us in a very strong position now, because what that now means is that, and let me talk about what's happening in the sector today to illustrate or give you a sense of what we are up to. So now what's happening is that as we look at the target out to 2030, renewables is intermittent and it's cheaper, but it's intermittent, right?
So storage is key.
Storage is key, and also from a DISCOM standpoint, they don't want to deal with the intermittency because it's just hard for them to do that. And so they're saying to us, look, can you give us power that is not totally intermittent in nature? Give us more managed kind of power. And so now what we are doing is, and this is I think fairly unique in the world, that India has come up with this innovation that in some ways we are pioneering, that you can combine solar and wind and storage together to provide a much more base load kind of power to the distribution companies, which is much easier for them to absorb. And by giving them that kind of power, which is not fully base load at this point, right, but it is moving in that direction, it therefore allows them to absorb a lot more renewable energy capacity. And that therefore allows us to start trying to meet the 2030 targets. So this is a pretty interesting evolution that is happening in the Indian context.
And then there's green hydrogen.
Yeah.
What is green hydrogen? What are you going to do in that space? And the fact that big corporations are making announcements, isn't it sounding like a very competitive space?
Yes, it is. And you asked me the question earlier about what does it mean to be a decarbonization company. And, while the core electricity sector is something that now you can deal with through all these round-the-clock power solutions using wind and solar, I think the next evolution that is happening now is in the fact that we are now being able to move renewable energy, which is up till now only going into the power sector, now more broadly into the rest of the energy value chain, which, as I said, is a much bigger part of the whole system, through the medium of green hydrogen. Okay. Now, what happens is that almost 75% of energy is consumed in mobility, whether it's shipping or aviation or cars, for example. A chunk of it also goes into heating applications, and it goes into various industries like steel and cement and so on. Now, those parts of the carbon emissions from the energy sector, we can start addressing through green hydrogen. And therefore, it really extends the whole impact of the clean energy transition much more broadly. And that's why it's such a central, and that's why there's so much buzz around it. Now, green hydrogen is made very simply by passing a current through water and separating out the hydrogen molecule from the oxygen molecule. And the current really means if you get that current or the power source being renewable energy, then it's clean, and that hydrogen produced in that manner is called green hydrogen. Okay, so that's very simple. You can also make hydrogen through gas, through methane steam reforming is a particular process, but that's very methane emitting. And that's what we are doing globally right now, right? And we need to move that into this other mechanism. And so that's why there's a lot of excitement around it, because it's got a massive amount of applications. It brings down methane, it brings down carbon emissions very fundamentally. And that is why all governments around the world are saying, how can we move towards green hydrogen? Because that will allow us to really bring down carbon emissions much more substantively. And there is a belief that over time, the cost of producing this green hydrogen can become competitive with the cost of producing hydrogen formed from gas, which is called grey hydrogen. And that is something that remains to be seen. But that's why there's so much buzz around green hydrogen.
So I want to regroup and come back to ReNew and say that today, again, I'm referring to the term decarbonization solutions provider. Are you looking at building capacity in renewable? Are you looking at partnering with large Indian corporates, with large overseas corporates? Are you looking at the technology piece to really be the pioneer on how to get there first and fast? So, how is that whole portfolio shaping up?
Sure. So, really what we are doing is, okay, let me take a step back. The cost of producing green hydrogen, 70% of that is the cost of producing renewable energy. Okay, the electrolyzer part is only about 30%.
Okay.
Now, obviously, renewable energy is something that we understand, extremely well. And therefore, it's a very natural extension for us and for a number of other renewable energy companies to bolt on an electrolyzer in front of the renewable energy, and hey presto, you become a green hydrogen provider as well, right? And that's something that we are looking at doing as well. Now, if you look at green hydrogen, there are broadly two applications of green hydrogen. One, you replace grey hydrogen, right? Which itself will require something like, or let me put it this way, replacing 1 million tons of green hydrogen requires about 50,000 megawatts of renewable energy capacity. Okay, and we have 100 million tons of that being produced globally. So 100 times of that is the amount of renewables required, which is an enormous, huge addition to the power sector, renewable energy as well. So we intend to play a big role in that. Now, what we're going to do is, we are in India, we have a tie-up or a joint venture with Indian Oil Corporation and L&T to essentially supply green hydrogen to Indian customers, whether they are in refineries, refining companies, or whether they are fertilizer companies or other users of grey hydrogen. Those are the primary industries in which hydrogen is used. So that's for the domestic market. In addition to that, globally, a number of other parts of the world are trying to decarbonize their own sectors by trying to procure a lot of green hydrogen. And India is actually going to be one of the best places to make green hydrogen. And I think the government recognizes that, and which is why there's such a strong push right now to make India a big manufacturing location for green hydrogen.
Okay.
And
that's going to attract global investor interest.
It will, and the point is somebody has to execute these projects, and that's where we come in. We can put up the renewable energy part, supply that through wires into ports where you can put up the electrolyzers, make the green hydrogen there, convert it into green ammonia, which you can then put on a ship and send it to any part of the world.
Got it.
And India is a very competitive place to be doing all of this for a couple of reasons. One is we have a great grid. A grid allows us to produce in Rajasthan, for example, and ship to Tamil Nadu, to a port there, which most other parts of the world don't have that capability. So we can do some of those things. We also have the capability of doing these round-the-clock power solutions, which allows us to operate the electrolyzers much more evenly and get more mileage out of them. And so for those reasons, India is actually a very good location to produce hydrogen, and that's something that we intend to do as a company. And then thirdly, we look at whether selectively it makes sense for us to have a leg for hydrogen production outside India as well. Although we are in very early stages of looking at some of those things. But our primary thoughts are about whether we can actually produce green hydrogen and sell it to outside countries. Now, the only way in which anybody is going to make the investment in all of this is if you actually get a green hydrogen purchase contract in place, just like we have a power purchase contract, right? And so that is something that everybody in the world is thinking about. How should that work? Should it be long-term agreements? How should they be priced? Those are the conversations that we're having with.
And I guess you're also having conversations about definitions, right? Because the European Union definition of green hydrogen, different from ours, needs some sort of working through.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. Everybody in the world has a slightly different definition. We need to align them. Every country wants to start giving some degree of incentivization to making green hydrogen within their borders, as is India. Some countries like the US are giving much more incentive. Some countries are not giving any incentives. India is somewhere in the middle. And we need to have a level playing field.
Okay, on that note, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, I'm going to put my cynic hat on and say, what are the challenges as far as this sector's growth is concerned? Back in our conversation with Sumant Sinha in a moment. Welcome back to Serious Business on NDTV. We're in conversation today with Sumant Sinha, founder, CEO and chairman of ReNew, a leading decarbonization solutions provider. We've been talking about India's journey when it comes to renewable energy and ReNew's journey and what the world is seeking right now and whether or not India and Indian companies are well placed to deliver that. So we're going to come to the challenge piece. But before I ask that, top 3 policy enablers, and relatively recently, that have really sort of kept the momentum going for the growth of this sector, the renewable energy sector.
Well, the first I would say, which is very underappreciated, is the fact that the government created an entity called the Solar Energy Corporation of India. That allowed us to be one step removed from the distribution companies, which have credit standing which is not the best in the world. This allowed us to bring down cost and allowed us to sign comfortably long-term power purchase agreements. So that is, I think, number one. It also, by the way, brought discipline and transparency in the auctioning mechanism. So that is one. The second, I would say, is the fact that we have a single grid in the country, and that grid is being very well planned for future evolution of renewable energy capacity. And that is therefore allowing us to make sure that there is enough capacity for us to connect into.
Oh, that's
and send
great
the
to
power,
hear.
from one part of the country to a different part. And these round-the-clock solutions, for example, are enabled by the grid because we can actually put up the solar in Rajasthan, put up the wind in Karnataka, put up the battery somewhere else, and then combine all of this virtually into a round-the-clock power solution and sell it to an Uttar Pradesh or a Delhi or wherever. The third policy enabler, I would say, and there are actually quite a few competing things that the government has done, is, I think, really the fact that they've come out with purchase obligation targets, thereby putting some degree of pressure on the utilities to start shifting towards renewable energy. I would say those are the top 3 in my mind. But there are many, many more, frankly.
Well, it's good that we've got the sample of the top 3 because now I'm turning to challenges. And I'm sure as a company operating in that space, you're raring to go faster, wider, deeper, bigger. So if you had to say 3 things in the external environment, and I'm not saying it necessarily has to be policy, it could just be legacy infrastructure constraints, for example. What would be the top 3 challenges that come to your mind?
I think the top really would be land acquisition. That is something that we have to do at a very local level. And land is a state subject, so every state tends to have different laws. Therefore, acquiring land, is always not that straightforward because it's a very fragmented area, and therefore you have to go to, many, many farmers to acquire land for a project and so on. So that is number one. The second issue I would say that is somewhat challenging, financial health of the distribution companies.
Yes.
That is something that has not been resolved over the years that I've been in the sector, although there's been a lot of talk around it. And while the central government has insulated people, developers like us from taking that credit risk, nevertheless, we all know that at the back, that's what it is. And ultimately, it's the distribution companies that actually have to buy the power. And if they're not in good financial health, then the power demand from the consumer will not be transmitted seamlessly to people like us, right?
I mean, could that explain why there's this evolution of, captive project partnerships?
Partly, yes.
Because it's like security for both
Absolutely.
Parties, and you're in that space.
No, absolutely. Which is also why, because the distribution companies are relatively not that efficient, they load a lot of extra costs onto the power that they sell. And because of the subsidization of the retail customer, industrial customers end up having to pay a much higher charge. And therefore, for them, it's much easier to buy power directly from us and not have to pay all the other charges that they would have to pay to subsidize the DISCOM's performance in a way.
The big elephant in the room, of course, is humongous amounts of capital that this journey is going to require. And forget about the big picture. From the ReNew lens, is the capital available when you need it, in the size you need it?
Well, I would say to answer your first macro question about the capital required, you're absolutely right. Ours is a capital intensive sector. So it is going to require trillions of dollars in the future. much more so than has been invested in the oil and gas industry up till now. And you know how geopolitically important the oil and gas industry has been. We need the clean energy industry to become, or will become, in fact, even bigger from a geopolitical lens. And we are going to get there eventually. Now, is the capital available? Look, I think for properly designed policies, for properly designed investment opportunities, there's sufficient amounts of capital out there, right? We as a company have raised, our balance sheet size is now getting to $10 billion, right? Which we've raised through a mix of debt and equity. And if you add the refinancing that we've done, we've raised close to $15 billion of total capital. Now, the reality is capital markets are volatile, right? And as we've discovered over the last couple of years, while the Fed has been increasing interest rates and has been sucking out liquidity, that has made things a little harder for the industry, not just in India, but globally as well. I would say India has been somewhat insulated from it, actually. And this is again where one of the interventions of policy has been helpful, that organizations like the Power Finance Corporation and REC and IRIDA are lending actually in a big way to our sector, and therefore have not allowed us to face the capital deficiency type situations that have been faced by companies in the Western world. But this volatility of capital certainly is not healthy for our sector, because we need every country in the world to be adding tons of capacity in renewables. And to me, really, this whole increase in interest rates actually has been quite negative for our sector outside of India. I think in India we haven't felt the impact of it.
Well, I have to honestly admit that talking to you today has left me with a clearer sense of just where we are right now, and optimism about the future as well. But as I said in the beginning, I'm going to say at the end, we've got a big job ahead of us. Well, thank you for your time. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you.